this afternoon in collaboration with the generous support of National ICAA to welcome David Rau for Reawakening. For those of you new to the ICAA, we are a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancing of the classical tradition in architecture, urbanism, and the allied arts. We do this through education, publication, and advocacy. We welcome all of you newcomers to join us, our vibrant organization, as a member by visiting classicist.org. There's a chat window to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, say hello, but save your questions until the end and post them in the Q&A area. There are over 130 people signed up for the lecture, but we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Also, our executive director, Sarah McDonald, is about to post a link to sign up for AIA credits. And finally, most importantly, this lecture is being hosted by our emerging professionals group, named the New Vitruvians. I welcome Kathleen Eustace, their chairwoman and fellow board member, to introduce David Rau.
Thank you, David, and thank you all so much for coming. This is the first event hosted by the New Vitruvians, which is the new emerging professionals group for the ICAA New England. Like all ICAA emerging professionals groups, our goal is to expand on the work of our main chapter, but also to connect students and young professionals and serve them in their interest in classical architecture. So if you are a young professional or student, I highly encourage you to go check out your region's emerging professionals group if they have one. But especially to those in the New England area, I invite you to join our Facebook group, which I'll link in the chat in just a few minutes. We're a small group, we're new, so we'd love to have you on board. Don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. I'll also post my email address. But yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you are a student or young professional, or really anyone in this space, if you want to get more involved in planning our future events, or want to keep closer watch on our events down the line. So that's the New Vitruvians. We're excited to be here and to have David Rau speaking for our first event. David Rau joins us, the New England chapter, for the second time. He was a past Bullfinch keynote speaker, and that's where I heard him for the first time speak. It was quite the memorable talk, so we're very, very excited to have you back. David is partner at Hart Howerton and is an architect of over 25 years of professional experience. And his achievements are many. His buildings and interiors are widely published. His work includes large, complex assignments for worldwide destination resorts, residential communities, cultural centers, and urban infill developments. He also serves on the editorial board of The Classicist, which is the national journal of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. And he's a frequent lecturer as well. He recently led a panel on absolution through architecture at Congress for New Urbanism's 26th Congress. And a few years ago, he delivered a TED Talk as part of a regional TEDx event, of which this talk is an expansion of. So after this event, if you are looking to take it all in again, but only have 10 minutes, please do check it out. I highly encourage you to. But if you have more time, we are also recording this event, so you can watch it again and again if you so choose to. So don't forget to prepare your questions. As David mentioned, we have the Q&A box, so save them for the end and post your questions in that Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And in the meantime, introduce yourselves, and again, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you're in the New England region and would like to get involved. So I will hand it off to David now. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and I'll hand it off to you. You can share your screen.
Great, thank you for that terrific introduction. Let me switch over to my slides. Okay, is everything in place on your end, Kathleen? All good. Okay, so thanks everyone for taking some time to be here together today. It's really a privilege to be with you all virtually, surrounded by so many like-minded friends, colleagues, and to be part of this great organization. The ICAA is doing really awesome work to preserve and promote the ideals of classicism very broadly through its programs in education, travel, and with talks like this. The implication of all this institutional effort, beyond just retelling the story of traditionalism, is, I think, to make classicism relevant in the here and now, to take it from memory to action, and to use the tenets of classicism to build not just monuments to the past, but a link to the future. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. I thought I would begin with this quote by everyone's favorite hero, Ralph Waldo Emerson, which might start to explain the title image I've chosen for this talk. The greatest delight which the fields and woods minister is the suggestion of an occult relation to man and the vegetable. He's talking about a sort of natural holiness, maybe a path to the future, but through a spiritual relationship with nature. So today, I'd like to think not so much about the great precedents from classicism's past, but about the future of architecture. I'd like to plant a seed about a reawakening, a renewal, a season of faith and change and growth within the world of traditionalism, and even within the dogma of classicism. But to talk about the future, about something new, I'll need to start with the past. So before we really get going, I have a disclaimer. I'm an architect who happens to have a healthy interest in history, but I am decidedly not a historian. Most architects tend to think they're historians, but architects and historians seem to operate from completely different cranial lobes. Although there are architects who have actually been trained to also think like a historian, but they're the unicorns, a really very rare breed. Anyway, I approach this talk from the lens of a practicing architect. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a philosopher, and definitely not a historian. So anyway, yes, I'm an architect and a principal at Hart-Howerton, a large architecture and planning firm. Before the pandemic, I split my time between our offices in New York and San Francisco, since my projects span between Waikiki and Cape Cod, plus a few places in between. I'll be sharing some of my own work during the first part of this talk, both at Hart-Howerton and from before. This is a project called Quirk Hotel in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I've spent my lockdown period during the pandemic. Hart-Howerton has been around for over 50 years now, and somehow we managed to keep a nice low profile, so I don't expect many of you to have heard of us, but if you travel, you've probably seen our work and just didn't know it. The firm was founded by Robert Lamhart, or just Bob as we know him, who from the very beginning set off on a path to design places for people, with an emphasis on shared experience, community, and social bonds. That set the tone for the firm's work through to today, even though Bob is now retired with emeritus status. And as it happens, all throughout my career, I've been lucky to work on interesting projects, made more interesting by collaborating with some great people who, like Bob Hart, have helped shape my approach to the work. This is the Homestead, a resort in the town of Hot Springs, set within a valley in the mountains of Virginia, specifically Bath County, population 4,297 souls. And to be clear, that's the population of the entire county. I was privileged to lead the renovation, restoration, and expansion of this remarkable American icon over a period of about 25 years. We handled architecture, interior design, landscape architecture, among other things. The Homestead is the type of place that feels like it's been there forever, or at least for some indeterminate time frame. It's blessed with that rarest of descriptors. It's timeless. The stone, the brick, the hard mountain earth, and of course its people, an unending cavalcade of people, created the character of this unique corner of the universe. And in this respect, the Homestead has been there forever. By that I mean the natural mineral springs that gave both Hot Springs and Bath County their names have been bubbling up from deep within the earth apparently since prehistory. The very idea of the Homestead, being a place to take the waters, is a timeless antediluvian construct. You are quite literally bathing naked in the past. And it's the perpetual presence of water here that taught me my place in the order of things, not really the Pyrenean, very Virginia buildings built over decades by a range of architects who preceded me. All through those 25 years, I was lucky to work with craftsmen, artists, conservators, and historians to research, restore, rebuild, reimagine, and remake this place. But really the assignment was just to keep the Homestead alive. By the time I first arrived, the owners had just switched from Coke to Pepsi because the Coke distributor had cut off their credit. There were problems everywhere you looked. Ironically, to save it, my job has been to change the Homestead, to bring it into the future, but hopefully without anyone noticing. Really, we were just dragging the past into the future. Eventually, virtually all of the homestead was made fresh again, and in some cases entirely new. We added buildings and pools, sometimes harnessing those subterranean waters. We restored its woodwork, its slate, its patinaed copper, and blackened ironwork, all for the millennial generation and beyond. This is a room we newly created from scratch. The biggest compliment I ever get is when someone can't believe we had ever done anything there at all, that the homestead was still today just the way it's always been. This was a seminal lesson for me. So anyway, not long ago, I went to Venice with my wife. Somehow, we hadn't been back to Venice for 25 years, having last been when we were on our honeymoon and we were young newlyweds with backpacks. Here's a photo of us on our 25th anniversary. This time we left the backpacks at home and did it in style. I'm happy to report that on that trip, Venice was essentially the same as it was 25 years ago. Architecturally speaking, there's really nothing new in Venice. Sure, there were even more tourists this time. I like to think of Venice as the world's longest running perpetual World's Fair. The Grand Canal, the Piazza San Marco, the Bridge of Sighs, all of it seemed like it would always be the same. Being an architect, married to an architectural historian, we bought a print of an 18th century engraving to bring home. It now hangs in our living room. And here it is. It dawned on me that the architecture of Venice today looks pretty much just like this, even though this picture was made almost 300 years ago. And some of the buildings shown are actually from the 15th century, and still others were built on foundations older than that. It's as if the succeeding generations of Venetians were building something all with like minds, and they were making one big, beautiful composition across time. Sure, there are lots of remarkable buildings in Venice, but not all of them are the same, and not all are noteworthy. But the overall effect is one of sweeping majesty. It may sound trite, but Venice is made for looking, for living, and for loving. And when you find yourself in Venice, it feels like the future will always look precisely like the past. And that's when I had my reawakening. And it was an architectural reawakening. What makes some cities like Venice so beautiful? Why can't all cities be beautiful like Venice? And what's happened to make everywhere that isn't a UNESCO World Heritage Site so vulnerable, and specifically vulnerable to architecture itself, the very thing that might save it? Here's Hudson Yards, which recently opened in New York's West Side. It's been in the news and some of you may have already visited. Its architects are a who's who of international design talent. The central theme structure, as we like to say in planning circles, was done by Thomas Heatherwick, the British wunderkind architect who was briefly rumored as the frontrunner to design a replacement spire on Notre Dame. The vessel, as it's called, is a type of inverted stepwell, but it's been closed recently due to multiple unrelated suicides. As for the rest of the buildings there, I've come to think of Hudson Yards as Houston Yards. Its steel and glass towers look, to me at least, like they came from Texas or anywhere other than New York, which after all was a brick and stone city until modernism arrived. Are these buildings beautiful? That's probably a topic for another talk, but they certainly do look shiny and slick, somehow synthetic, and that may, in fact, be the big idea. A sort of flashy fake New York, sort of synthetic. But this shouldn't come as a surprise because the buildings largely are synthetic. Like most buildings today, the architecture of Hudson Yards is built on products born of an industrial manufacturing complex, employing new materials and processes intended to solve every architectural problem with new technology. This was intended to set the designer free, and apparently wildly free. This is state-of-the-art architecture today. Ironically, this type of development is invariably pitched to the public as sustainable, green, and resilient, often relying on plush images of the landscape design. In fact, it's a great time to be a landscape architect since the ground plane is now the antidote to all those hard steel and glass buildings. And still, sometimes the buildings get awarded by the US Green Building Council with silver, gold, or platinum LEED certification. Part of Hudson Yards has already received platinum certification, the highest award. But look beneath the shiny surface of most buildings built in the last half century, and you'll find not just a synthetic style, but actual synthetics. Plastic, actually, and lots of it. In my daily work as an architect, it's hard to avoid plastic. It's everywhere. It's the high fructose corn syrup of building products. And yes, this is a still from the scene in Mrs. Robinson where Dustin Hoffman's character gets a one-word stock tip, which is simply plastics. Plastic was invented in 1862, then really got started in 1907 when Leo Baekeland created the first thermoset plastic and trademarked it after himself as Bakelite. Now a panoply of plastics envelop our buildings. There's polyurethane in paint and insulation, epoxies in adhesives and flooring, phenolics in enamel coatings, wall coverings, and decorative laminates for countertops. There are acrylics in light fixtures, polystyrene in foam board, polycarbonates in electrical wiring, and polyamides in carpet, or make that in most carpet. Polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, or just plain vinyl, is the most ubiquitous of them all. It's used in flooring, siding, piping, and single-ply roofing. There's seemingly nothing you can't fashion out of it. And it's not just in the walls and floors of buildings. Plastic is also inside buildings. The desk chair and the desk where you sit while at work, or maybe where you are right now, are probably at least partly plastic. In fact, the world's best-selling task chair, Herman Miller's iconic Aeron chair, is made of 27% plastic. Over 7 million Aeron chairs are produced every year, and that's a lot of plastic. The granddaddy of all plastics, polyethylene, was created in 1933 by two chemists at ICAA. You probably know one of the best-selling polyethylene products in the world by DuPont's trademark name, Tyvek. Today, essentially every home in America is wrapped in a plastic film of Tyvek, each house averaging almost 3,000 square feet of the stuff. And this doesn't count all the apartment buildings and commercial structures where Tyvek is being used by the acre. Given HUD's estimate of 1.2 million housing starts annually over the last few years, that's about 3 billion square feet of Tyvek mass produced and installed every year. But now there's a new consciousness about plastics. We've all seen images of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a pelagic column of plastic and petroleum sludge, sometimes reaching down miles to the bottom of the ocean. It's not going away either. Most plastic only ever degrades into ever tinier pieces or particulates, gradually entering the food chain, eventually making its way onto our plate as microscopic bits. Some plastics actually do degrade, but only into even more toxic component chemicals. These then infiltrate flora and fauna, altering hormonal responses, reproductive systems, and neurological functions. Tyvek is also the best-selling hazmat suit in the world, and it's used for sterile medical packaging and lots of other things. But the secret to Tyvek's success as a building material came when FedEx used it for its soft shipping packs, and DuPont strategically set up a recycling facility in Richmond, Virginia. They do recycle over 30,000 pounds of Tyvek every year there, but you have to FedEx the FedEx pouches back at your own cost. And by comparison, that same manufacturing facility has produced billions of pounds of the stuff. Regardless, once those FedEx packs qualified Tyvek as a recyclable material, DuPont's house wrap version of the product began getting credits toward LEED certification from the US Green Building Council. So Tyvek is now an industry standard. This is recycling, enabling more plastic, not less. So is that a good thing? And there is no publicly available data on how much of the house wrap has been recycled, if any, really. I shared that little story about plastic and about Tyvek specifically as a parable on the nature of the building industry today. Some of us are lucky to work on authentic places like the homestead, but for most architects, plastic is perfectly acceptable. It's standard operating procedure. As architects, we're often controlled not by design ideas, but by manufacturing processes, market forces, and regulations that sometimes go against our better intuitions. Plastic today is a part of our conception of the modern world. It's a given. But it's important to remember that the notion of modernism is already at least 100 years old. Modernism isn't really modern anymore at all. Virginia Woolf pegged the start of the modern movement at 1910, in December 1910 to be exact, when this work by Manet was first exhibited in London. By 1919, a little over 100 years ago, the Bauhaus was established in Germany, and they began building the buildings that look like what we think of today as modern. And by 1931, this building was built in Philadelphia, and it became the first modern style skyscraper in America. And the rest is now modern history. Today, we see projects announced in the news that perpetuate this idea of modernism as inevitable, and it's ever more extreme. Postmodernism of the late 20th century would seemingly have marked the end of modernism, being post-modernism and all, but contemporary modernist architecture seems to be experienced as sort of half-lives. I'd like to think of the period we're in now as post-postmodernism. These are the plasticky parametric buildings sprouting around the landscape today. And the march into the future goes on relentlessly, notwithstanding the ICAA's best efforts to the contrary. So is modernity our destiny? And what does that mean anyway? Everything begins and ends. What happens at the end of modernism, or postmodernism, or post-postmodernism? Or does it ever end? Or have we arrived at a finite modern world as a culture? Is it just going to keep getting shinier and with slightly better iPhones released each year? And this also begs the question, what is classicism's place in this contemporary context of technology and science, other than to be relegated to the outer fringes, a curious, separate pursuit? Here's a picture of the first meeting of SIAM in 1928 in Switzerland, the famous international meeting of architects credited with creating the modern movement in architecture. And there's the young Le Corbusier smack in the middle with his little round glasses and a bow tie, like David Andreossi today, looking like he would fit in at an ICAA event. SIAM wrote a manifesto, which to an extent was the model for many subsequent manifestos, including the now revered Charter for the New Urbanism. In their manifesto, SIAM essentially laid out all of society's ills at classicism's feet, and this was even before World War II. And so that modernist manifesto of the last mid-century is still all around us, underlying a schism. But that idea of modernism is itself old thinking. Modernism isn't really very modern, and some of it is only skin deep. And SIAM was over a century ago. We're several generations beyond it. The millennials and now Generation Z really don't care to stress out over Nazism or the despicable deeds of long gone kings and queens. And they're more likely to choose where they live based on things like walkability, bike lanes, and proximity to the closest Whole Foods. The average hipster bar these days looks like an old library in that King's Castle. This is the library at the Nomad Hotel, near where my wife and I live when we're at home in our apartment in New York. The library bar is always packed, but fortunately, if you can't get a seat here, there are plenty of places like it within walking distance. As for modernism, it's had its own share of awkward associations with fascism, socialism, the nanny state, dehumanizing public housing, and straight up bad urbanism. Here's Corbu again, you can tell by the glasses, this time designing the palace of the Soviets for Stalin. And here's his earlier plan to raise Paris. He liked the Tuileries and the Champs-Élysées so much he thought to quadruple its size and build towers in the park. Fortunately, none of this came to pass in central Paris, but much of it did elsewhere. In fact, it came to define urbanism, and especially social housing around the globe. Here's the equally ironic and iconic Pants building Rem Koolhaas designed for the Chinese state-run television station in Beijing. Again, this is old thinking presented as something new. This is Sir Norman Foster's headquarters for Apple, which opened to some general yawning, and it's also generally considered by most other Silicon Valley tech companies as how not to do it. Or there's this new building by Jean Nouvel in Australia, where big mirrors are used to reflect sunlight downward to get plants to grow in a crevasse on the north face of the building. This is apparently what passes as green architecture, machines engineered for growing things, but not too natural themselves. And lastly, this is David Adjaye's poverty housing project in Harlem called Sugar Hill. Is this modernism at its best or an architectural crime? But no matter, the New York Times loved it, and the Sohn Foundation gave the architect its highest honor. I'll let you think about that for a moment. So where are we now? As an architect, I get asked a lot about what's next. Architecture is expensive, it takes time, Clients don't want to embarrass themselves or be out of sync, out of style, or to miss a moment in the marketplace of ideas. Something about the future is coming, after all, constantly shifting, just on the horizon, adapting to endless changes in technology. But despite that, somehow we all already know what the future is supposed to look like. It seems that all of us grow up with this notion of the future being futuristic, that it will somehow, inevitably, eventually look like the Jetsons. Maybe this image isn't so far off once Elon Musk figures out how to get the Teslas to fly. Disney has capitalized on our fantasies about the future to the point where it became a type of romantic folklore, something we pass down through generations. It's as if the future has come to have a history. It's important to understand that this story, the history of architecture with a preordained path leading to an ever more modern future, borrows from the idea of evolution, but it corrupts it. It's the notion that we as a species have evolved even in the last century, or maybe a little more, but fairly recently, that we're somehow different lately and getting more different all the time. And so our buildings must continually keep being more different too. But that's a standard misreading of Charles Darwin's world-changing treatise on the origin of species. Darwin knew that evolution simply evolves. It's random. Diversity, not gradual refinement, is evolution's greatest tool. It's a hit or miss process, going forwards, sometimes failing, then going back, and even starting all over again sometimes. This is Darwin. I am inclined to look at everything as resulting from designed laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we call chance. Thanks to the Human Genome Project, which is now over 25 years old, we know for certain that our own species has actually evolved almost not at all from our Paleolithic ancestors of 10,000 years ago. Evolution, Darwin knew, is mostly about changes in the weather over eons and the ability of the species to compete for resources under those shifting circumstances. But that's about it. Evolution goes round and round. Sorry. Most of the things that instinctively drive us, like love, intimacy, jealousy, fear, all tie us inexplicably to our ancestors living in the wilderness with essentially the same set of genes and emotions we feel today. Plus, all this evolving takes time, virtually forever in evolutionary time. So chances are we won't be able to evolve enough or fast enough to adapt to climate change. Natural selection will not be in time to save us this time from climate change. Even our sense of creativity is prehistoric. In other words, we humans aren't becoming a race of uniquely modern men and women. We are, for now, at least essentially, primal. Einstein, of course, helped create our idea of the future, defining a brave new world of quantum mechanics, relativity, and the nuclear fission. But despite all this seemingly forward-looking and groundbreaking work, even Einstein questioned the idea of the future being futuristic. He said, the distinction between the past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. And in fact, Einstein's theory of general relativity is actually all about skewing time, or the space-time continuum anyway, that gravity can bend time, that all things in time are relative based on their physical relationship, and that time can pass more quickly in one place than in another, that the future is, in fact, not what it seems. So we've reached a point of deep introspection. Where are we headed as a culture? Where might architecture be headed? Well, I believe there are a few cultural shifts that point to a new, dramatically different direction. I'd like to share 3 of these ideas with you, and I'll start by talking about food and architecture. It now seems universally accepted that whole foods are best for our bodies. This idea all started with the slow food movement. Slow food was founded in Italy in the 80s as a response to a fast food McDonald's opening at the foot of the Spanish Steps in Rome. A group of Italian foodies set up on a sidewalk in front of that McDonald's and passed out free bowls of pasta to passersby in protest. And presto, the slow food movement was born. and that McDonald's is still there, but the future of food has changed forever. Slow Food's motto is good, clean, and fair, and now any restaurant or grocery store worth its salt is bragging about its farm-to-table program. Michael Pollan has had a string of bestsellers debunking the industrial food complex and the processed foods and synthetic additives that make us sick. We now know, most of us anyway, that fresh, homemade, local foods are healthiest for us. And this has spawned a transformation in organic farming and ignited a community garden movement. In other words, we're looking to the past for the answers as far as food concerned. We're going back to nature. But to a great extent, this backward glance in food is being powered by technology. For instance, Earthbound Farms invented the pre-washed salad market by developing their own processing, washing, and packaging systems. Also, these delicate little heirloom salad greens can be cleaned and shipped around the country all year long. So it's organic, but it's facilitated by high technology. Starbucks uses sophisticated transaction systems to monitor sales and inventory with social networks across the internet to track customer behaviors. And there are fancy barista-proof espresso machines, all meant to deliver an artisanal handmade cup of espresso. This is Polyface Farms, a family-run organic farm in Virginia that pioneered the use of mobile chicken coops to allow for free-range poultry production without the usual impact on the land. In all these examples, while the technology plays an important role, it's a supporting role. It alone isn't the product, and the products themselves aren't technological. Instead, technology is leveraged behind the scenes to deliver natural, organic, local, and handcrafted products. Why isn't architecture like that? And when the food hits the table, it's all about deliciousness, not the technology behind it. It's about taste and tradition, pure, clean, wholesome, healthy taste. What we put in our bodies, what we consume, and how we eat as a society defines us as a culture. And we are undeniably traditional, even classic, in our tastes in food. We've had a gastronomic reawakening. The second of these cultural shifts happening now has to do with happiness. Happiness, it turns out, is serious stuff. Not long ago, the ruler of Bhutan announced that he was abolishing the GDP and instead was instituting the gross domestic happiness. That may sound a little flaky, but right in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson named the pursuit of happiness as one of our 3 inalienable rights as Americans. Lately, there's a new science of happiness. In the last quarter century, scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and economists have been testing us and conducting polls, then compiling the data about what makes us happy. Authors of all stripes are picking through these findings to figure out what it means in daily life. Charles Montgomery aggregated a lot of this data in his book, Happy City. Sometimes it's just what you'd expect. For instance, money doesn't really make us happy. Neither does a high IQ. And in America, a Gallup poll shows that we have flatlined in reported happiness over the last few decades. And as it turns out, even technology doesn't directly make us happy. We've discovered other things that make us not so happy or downright unhappy. Your chances of divorce are pretty much proportional to your commute time in minutes. People who live above the 6th floor have the highest suicide rates. And as far as obesity, people who live on the cul-de-sacs of suburbia are at the greatest risk. Where we live and the buildings in which we live have been documented as mattering gravely to our health, our mental well-being, and to our inalienable right to happiness. So what does make us happy? Well, sex, for one, which is probably obvious, but so does a sense of community, family, commitment, and some form of spirituality. Even more to the point, scientific studies all around the world show that people are, in documented fact, happiest in traditional old-fashioned towns. Anne Sussman, in her book Cognitive Architecture, makes the case that humans are thigmotaxic beasts. That is, we're wall huggers, which helps explain why Main Street works, at least while we're on foot. Some of this is old science already, the big picture stuff, like how we're hardwired to prefer bilateral shapes that mimic our bodies, our faces, our minds, and much of our world. And as for the design of new buildings, brain research is starting to tell us that what we instinctively already knew. We sense anxiety in sterile, undefined spaces where we don't feel we can defend ourselves or where no one is looking out for us. Blank walls, dead ends, and windowless spaces make us feel confused. These aren't merely opinions, they're facts. documented in research, although it seems we hardly needed studies to prove some of these things. Scientists using brain scans proved that we don't feel safe around sharp architectural shapes. So you probably get all this by now. We are our most authentic selves, our happiest, in the places built like the old parts of town. Otherwise, well, our lives are literally at risk. The early data coming from the neurosciences that we've been discussing makes it a safe bet that all these cyber data points, old and new, once assembled, will likely form a sort of algorithm describing a very traditional or even a classical world. We have had a cognitive reawakening. The last cultural shift is about human craft, and more to the point of today's talk, what exactly is the relationship between people and machines? One of the flaws of the idea of the future and futurism itself has always been population growth. It's the underbelly of modernism. It's a dirty little problem. Again, technology was going to be the answer, making more people more productive, letting them live more carefree lives. But with more people doing less, the opposite is often true. The more that machines do the work, the less rewarding the work and the less work for people. Glenn Adamson, former director of the Museum of Art and Design, in his book, Fewer Better Things, makes the case for the rebirth of the handmade trades, not just as a reaction to mass-produced materialism and technology, but as a legitimate, even honorable career alternative. It's unfortunate we've lost our way with this, often marginalizing those who choose not to go to college or take up one of the professions. Before industrialization, development of a manual skill was considered a noble pursuit, often organized around guilds and ateliers. We've somehow forgotten that human power is the most efficient force on the planet. As little machines, we're clean, at least when we clean up after each other. We're simply fueled, driven, and as a bonus, we also replicate ourselves like a charm. The vast sea of humanity seems destined to do more, be more, but most importantly, make more. In fact, people are made to make things. And if we don't, poverty and then unrest follows. If you look at it this way, something made by hand can be the most efficient form of construction. Handmade is sustainability made. Craft actually is green. And it follows that the more we make buildings that incorporate things that are made by hand, the more sustainable they are. We should be designing with the handmade in mind. To put it in reverse, anything without apparent handmade elements is less green by a degree. Handcrafted architectural embellishment is the hallmark of sustainability. We should have more ornament on our buildings. We have had a humanistic reawakening. So at the root of this whole discussion is the question of what exactly is architecture after all? Why do we build beyond mere necessity, and for whom do we build? And somewhere deep beneath the question of why we build is an even more puzzling conundrum. That is, who or what do we love? Mere buildings keep us dry, but architecture proves our devotion to something. The architectural historian and classical theorist William Westphal would stop us here and explain that classicism is emblematic of civic structure, of civitas. This is the Aristotelian view of the world. Rome works this way largely, or was at least built to. When we build our buildings, we are building the city in our image as a political body. Except it seems we've lost that ability. Can classicism really happen in a fractured democratic society like America in 2021, or in the European Union, or in Asia or Africa? Can we ever all build something together again that makes universal sense to everyone, that unifies our differences, that defies vulnerability? We don't currently seem to possess a unified vision of social order, religious, creative, or political, on which to build our cities. And so they tend to show it by varying degrees, and sometimes it can get pretty ugly. As a result, we tend not to build large classical civic structures. There are a few exceptions, exemplary as they may be. And sometimes forcing classicism on the public is met with controversy. So nowadays, classicism is mostly relegated to residential buildings, albeit some very fine ones, often out of view of the city. The big hurdle for new classicism is one of legitimacy. Classicism has been criticized as being not of our time. In short, it doesn't reflect the zeitgeist of the age. Traditional architects tend to bristle at the modernist notion that a building must be made of in our time. But I tend to agree it should. Why not? The reality is that classicism has repeatedly been modified for new purposes over the years. Classicism changes, suiting its time. So if you can't beat the argument, agree with it. I've come to think of this as transmutation in architecture. Like evolution, transmutation connotes an abrupt shift or change, the conversion of one thing utterly into another. Things change in unexpected, sometimes sideways ways. Caterpillars metamorphosize or transmute into butterflies. It's different than evolution. It's an almost unbelievable transformational feat, not some pathetic incremental mutation that might bear fruit over eons, but improbably, it can actually happen overnight. And classicism has repeatedly transmuted to stay of its time. For instance, broadly speaking, the Greeks invented what we now know as classicism, building temples dedicated to pagan gods. It was a polytheistic architecture designed in adoration of a panoply of uniquely Grecian gods. But then later, the Romans co-opted Greek classicism, expanding and modifying its basic tenets, then blithely assigning them to an entirely new set of gods, this time the gods of Roman mythology. Any association with the old Grecian deities, which the Romans would have considered heathen gods, was transmuted into something entirely new, and they revered their own new classicism. Any taint of Greek polytheism was spirited away. The Romans were opportunity scavengers. Then in the Italian Renaissance, classicism was transmuted again, this time in service of a monotheistic god. And again, as if by magic or maybe divine fiat, the Florentine papacy forgave Roman classicism and Greek classicism of all its pagan legacy and co-opted it for its own use. This change happened virtually in a moment, not over evolutionary time, and it went backwards again for renewal, all in the name of love for a single God in this instance. You can see transmutation in action again and again in the history of classical architecture. The Beaux-Arts transmuted classical architecture into a display of integrated artistic expression, something new and distinct yet again, and yet a reflection of the culture of its time. And later, the arts and crafts movement rejected the onslaught of factory-produced gadgets and gewgaws of the Industrial Revolution and transmuted traditionalism into an architecture of handiwork and spiritualism. Again, looking to the past to create the future anew. So here we are today. Unfortunately, with most new classical buildings built, we generally see an academic historicism. That is, it's revivalist. It isn't new per se. It usually follows one or the other of the past styles, codified in pattern books and treatises, sometimes copied from historic monographs or surveys. There's no real reason to be opposed to this type of work, this revivalism. Some of it, like the work of many ICAA members, can be masterful. I do work like this myself, and the ICAA supports this kind of work every day, but it can also be criticized as rote, scenographic, pastiche, or thin, maybe even a little elite. And modernism's chief complaint is certainly true here. These buildings are not really of their time. It seems the nostalgia for prior transmutations, no matter how completely or perfectly realized stylistically, is unlikely to enter into the mainstream of the architectural profession in today's technology-obsessed world. It can seem esoteric, too academic, and acquired taste. And for those of us anxious for a bursting forth of classicism in the form of a pristine new Renaissance, or a recall, as Andreas Dwani calls it, to galvanize the architectural profession as a whole towards traditionalism, and maybe even capture the attention of the AIA in the process, this is all unlikely to be achieved by way of revivalist historicism. So can we ever see another Renaissance, a new Renaissance? If the murmurings out there suggest that the future doesn't have to be futuristic, then the past can certainly revisit us on a grand scale. But this might come in entirely new clothes. When societies possess shared values, a unified adoration of some one powerful notion, that's what allows them and would allow us to build in unison again as a community, a city, a nation. If we asked the universe, or even just our hearts, what we should be building in our own day and time, what would be the answer? Standing here today, knowing what we do, understanding the reawakening happening all around us, or at least outside the halls of most architecture schools, it's pretty easy to see the world turning towards nature. The world is leaning into nature. This newfound love of ours of nature, biophilia, has been researched too. A study of office workers in 16 countries found that workspaces with biophilic elements were 6% more productive. In other words, we need nature in our buildings. So what is contemporary classicism doing about this? This is a sort of Arcadian vision of the future. We're already seeing this. We're going back to nature in food, in architecture, in metropolitanism. We understand we as humans are no longer at the center of the universe, and we've been humbled. We're a small but important player in an ecological drama that won't end even after we're all gone. And while it's true this kind of thinking is connected to the past, to Unitarianism, and to Harvard and the Metaphysical Club of Concord in the 1840s, it's also in tune with today, encompassing both the individual and the collective. Democratic, self-reliant, independent, free-thinking man and nature. And all this suggests a more fervid, riotous transcendentalism than what perhaps Emerson might have meant. All these ideas aren't new. Nothing ever is entirely new. But applying this framework to classical architecture for today is. And the difference between the original transcendental movement and today is the scientifically proven interdependence we have with nature, benefiting our health, well-being, and our happiness. This time around, it's not spiritual, it's scientific. We increasingly have proof. We know for a fact what we need. I like to think of architecture as mankind's place in nature. Based on where we are now as a culture, this should be the framework around which we discuss architecture. Mankind's place in nature. Rather than always building in revivalist styles, could we devise a new classical architecture based on the love of the natural world? And rather than building in revivalist historical styles, can we invent a classical architecture? Like any good Renaissance, it seems the first place we should look for how to do this is all the way back to the ancient Greek and Roman models, and even before, rather than the interleaving revivalist styles which tend to get us confused. But that backward glance should be through the lens of today, from here and now, using the filter of Mother Nature and the natural world and mankind's place in it. Looking back, it's clear classical design was almost exclusively done in idolization of natural forms, either realistically or in the abstract. And looking afresh at ancient classicism, all those pagan deities turned out to be gods of the natural world. So just like us, the Greeks and Romans revered the natural world, except their buildings actually looked like it and sent that message. There's a lot yet to discover in classicism when you look at it this way. There are clues in plain sight, perfectly in sync with the exigencies of today, of sustainability and biophilia, structure, decoration, site orientation, all leading to a new, expressively sincere green architecture. If we are now knowingly beholden to nature for our health, our happiness, our habitat, why is it so few of our buildings today display florid, flagrant images in adoration of nature? We should live our lives in the present, not in a newfangled future that never seems to come. We should live with the presence of the past, but expressed through dedication to nature. Not something old, something borrowed, or something copied. We need something new for us, for our time, for our future, on our terms. To that end, I've been thinking about a new way to look at classicism for today under the banner of whole architecture. And yes, the connection there to wholeness and wholesomeness and even whole foods is intentional. So to be clear, whole architecture is not meant to be a revivalist style. It's something new. It isn't based on pattern books or treatises. It's not derivative. This is a classicism that's natural, organic, handmade, local, fair, and just. So what are the tenets of a whole architecture? What are the rules or guidelines or beliefs in their essence and in their simplest forms represent a new way of describing classicism for its practical application in today's world? I'd like to wrap up now with a brief outline of the natural laws of whole architecture. First, the future will be natural. That is, whole architecture is built of natural materials. It's easy to get hung up defining the word natural, but we generally know what we mean when we say something is natural. The closer a material is to its origin and its original state, the better. It's just like with food. Wood, stone, clay, these are obvious natural materials. So are bricks, terracotta, and other types of tile, especially if it's handmade or hand-laid. Getting further afield, materials like iron, rubber, or linoleum are all reasonably close to their original form, if somewhat refined, but concrete and steel are not so natural and made in caustic manufacturing processes. And plastics and other overt synthetics should be seldom used. This is not a mandate of a precise list of approved materials, but simply to emphasize the use of more highly natural materials in our buildings. It's just a new way to organize materials in a range along a spectrum from most natural to least. We just should use more materials on the natural end of the spectrum. Second, the future will be organic. Whole architecture is organic. It arranges these natural buildings in organic ways. So how is organic different than natural? Organic implies something is living, part of an ecological or biological system. It's organized in logical patterns. It's believable to our primal minds. This means we should be assembling these natural materials in ways that create building compositions with structural configurations that relate to the real world, to our biological habitat. The shapes and forms of these buildings we make should be reasonable relative to the natural materials being used. And this is not about structural honesty. And I'm not a Luddite, but it's about creating an outward composition that conforms with how we're genetically programmed to sense material properties, to put us at ease, to be content, and yes, to make us happy. Third, the future will be handmade. Whole architecture is handmade to the extent that we can make it happen. Buildings should exhibit the hand of man or employ handcrafted elements, or at the very least use handmade forms, even if the final materials are reproductions or repetitive units of a handmade original, like hand-painted tiles. There should be more handmade ornament, much, much more handmade ornament in every building of every type. And the ornament should glorify nature in a plethora of ways. A building should be a paean to nature. The more handmade ornament a building has, the more our fellow humans can be engaged in honest, soul-satisfying labor. And the reverse is also true. Buildings without ornament rob men and women of their work, their human need to create, and their ability to attain satisfaction and happiness by doing handiwork. We have a responsibility to festoon our buildings. Fourth, the future will be local. Whole architecture is local. We should support the local community and buy building goods and services from nearby. Let's do like the slow food movement, build up the indigenous makers and crafters close to where we are. We should encourage small manufacturers, the artisanal tile makers, the small batch terracotta outfits, the single crew millworkers. Let's pay them a little more to get the good stuff. No more plastic made from oil from the Middle East. No Tyvek from Richmond, if you can help it. No steel from China, no marble from Madagascar. Don't expend a lot of energy shipping heavy stuff all around the globe. And fifth and last, the future will be fair and just. Perhaps most important, whole architecture is fair and just. This tenet is sometimes difficult, and it can be hard to look at ancient classicism through a lens of equity or universal design. But this is about civic virtue, justice, and civility today, illustrated by classical forms. It's the civitas of classical thinking applied to whole architecture, then expressed in a new contemporary way. So before I'd like to leave you with a manifesto for whole architecture in the form of a little poem called The Nature of the Future. How will we build the future? By hand, by eye, by head and heart, in wood and stone, in slate and brick, with friends and family, hearts and mind, plain and simple, clean and pure. We will live our future in the present, under the arches of nature's bowers, lit by firelight and the lantern of ideas. So that's my architectural reawakening, that this can happen here and now, that classicism of the ancients isn't only about the orders, the patterns, and syntax. It's also about claiming our place in the universe and mankind's place in nature. And that maybe the future doesn't have to look like we've all been led to believe. It doesn't have to look futuristic at all, but instead it can look more like the past than we ever imagined. Okay, thank you.
David, that was absolutely wonderful. It is so poignant and so relevant. And what people don't realize, I think you and I, we met almost 10 years ago in Charleston, is that there's a movement that's going on. And everyone, a lot of the people look at this modern versus traditional world and feel like we're losing because that's all we read. But the reality is that there are these little cells that are building right now underground, and a lot of them are in Europe, and a lot of them are with youth. And things are starting to get momentum. And so what you've talked about is what you've developed over the last 10 years or 8 years since we met, 10 years or so since you did your TED Talk, is just becoming more and more refined. And there's so many other parallel movements that are occurring. So it was just so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a process for me to sort of develop this. And, you know, do I do all these things in my daily work? No, I can't. I have to sometimes, you know, use materials that I don't want to be using, but it has shifted my thinking in the choices I make, and also sort of advocating to the teams I work with to think a little differently. And it's, you know, moving the needle by increments, not always, you know, dramatically.
Your point early on about Hudson Yards is unbelievably poignant. I suggest consider that 90 years ago, the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building were built within 1 year of each other, and then also Rockefeller Center. These three buildings, I suggest 90 years from now, does anybody have any doubt that those three structures will still not exist and be adorned by New Yorkers? And turn that around, does anybody think that one building from Hudson Yards will be around 90 years from now? And that project cost $25 billion. So what is resilience?
Exactly. I think, you know, my answer, resilience is building with nature and thinking completely different. Those three buildings, Rockefeller Center, the Empire State Building, and the Chrysler Building, are masonry buildings. They're stone. The stone came at least from the United States, if not upstate New York. So it's a much different approach than Hudson Yards, for sure.
They relate to culture and people. And to me, if it's loved by the people, then it's going to be saved and adorned. And if it doesn't relate to people and it just wins some awards for a short period of time, makes a lot of glossy magazines, and then starts to fall apart for Vitruvian reasons and for as far as all of the Vitruvian principles, then it's just not going to last, and it's not going to be loved. So the first question comes, it says, thank you for referencing petrochemical octopus that has us firmly in its grip. Why aren't more traditional architects pointing to our dependence on oil manufacturing to convey contemporary design solutions? Borrowing from Kunstler, using Hudson Yards as an example, has our reliance on hyper-complex systems voided our ability to sponsor a building culture worth defending?
Yeah, I think the root of the evil is really the myth of recycling and the fact that it has enabled not less plastic in the world, but more, because there's a sort of false sense that because of recycling, because our carpets are made out of old Coke bottles, or we can get shoes made out of, you know, old shopping bags, that somehow everything's all right and therefore plastic is valid. But instead, it just perpetuates, it engenders more and more and more plastic, because people don't have a sense of the finite situation that it's in, and that recycling really is not 100% efficient sort of process. And I think that the mood about plastic is changing. I mean, a lot of grocery stores are changing their attitude about plastic bags. States are passing laws about plastics. I just bought a 6-pack of beer that came, instead of with the little plastic rings on the beer, it now has a paper thing. So there are other ways to have all these things that plastic are made from.
Question about that. I know for homeowners, vinyl is a really popular, well, and developers for a lot of different types of buildings. Vinyl is a really popular choice because it lasts a long time, it's super easy to maintain. If you had to choose a different material that would replace vinyl, what would you choose that had the same cost effectiveness and kind of maintenance?
Yeah, I mean, I have this conversation on a lot of my projects, and a lot of times the contractor wants to use the vinyl. There's perceived cost savings. And then, my recommendation is always natural wood. So cypress or cedar or something like that, and to paint it. And on more than a few occasions, a sort of deep dive on the analysis in terms of the cost to achieve the details you want, versus the vinyl product. And also this is true of cementitious siding like hardy plank, hardy board. It's often more difficult to install. It also comes with other sort of sustainability problems. I mean, concrete is actually a very caustic material. So, and the production of vinyl is a very caustic production process. So on more than a couple of occasions, I've been successful in getting wood seen as really the value proposition, the right thing to do. And it's really just talking that through and trying to win as many battles as you can.
I think there was a question related. Also, what should we use instead of typed on houses? How can that evolve in a sustainable way that is also effective? I'm not sure if I, instead of
Tyvek?
Oh, yeah, I think
instead of Tyvek.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would I get asked that question all the time. So before Tyvek, houses were built and had either some sort of builder's felt or paper or other things that are all still on the market, probably at your Lowe's. They stock this alternative stuff. It's true that some of it is coated with petroleum products again, but it's on a matrix of paper or some other backing. So I think again, looking to the past and the things that worked, and those products have also been on a parallel track getting improved upon. They haven't just laid dormant in the marketplace. So I think that there are choices out there if you just think to look.
This is a good question, and there's probably two different answers for this, but if the future is local, obviously materials and vernacular, should architects be local as well? I mean, that is local labor.
I think that's a good question. I spent the better part of my career in Richmond, Virginia, which is a medium-sized town, capital of Virginia. And we would have the experience of the New York architects, the Boston architects coming to our town to build the museums and the fancier houses and things like that. And I think that there is something to be said about encouraging the local design community. They will get better if they're used more frequently and given more opportunities and more resources. So yeah, I would advocate for local to extend to the design community.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, unless you're looking for a specific expertise where you definitely would rather have somebody that has 25 years in a particular vernacular, particular archetype, that if you're looking for something general, and this is the problem with sort of showy award architecture, is you go for the star architect because you want to put the star architect's name on the building.
Right.
And so that's sort of, to me, that's missing the point of being a patron. And as you just mentioned, supporting your local community, artistic community.
Right.
We have a question. Can we get that poem again? It was just beautiful.
You wanted again?
Yeah.
Are we at the end? I can do it as people say.
We can figure it out and we can post it.
Right, we'll post it.
Favorite
Okay.
question. So as you mentioned, market forces are a big problem or big reason for kind of traditional architecture supposedly not being so prevalent. So what is a financial incentive for a developer to kind of stop what they're doing and build in a traditional style? Because we know people prefer, traditional areas, but are there any financial incentives to kind of get a developer interested in learning about traditional architecture and building in a traditional architecture? Maybe from the side of people, it being more higher prices at the end when you build it,
right.
Or maybe the myth, or maybe it's not a myth, of the cost of building it isn't true. Just kind of, can you talk about like financial incentives to get developers interested in traditional architecture?
Yeah, developers and other entities that hire architects and build buildings are generally driven by the return on investment, the ROI. And this is outside of maybe the homeowner who might have other sort of more personal reasons. But generally somebody building a commercial project to sell single family houses or rent multifamily or office space, or a lot of my work is with hotels, capturing a certain market. I do a lot of spas, getting people to, spas are now a very competitive market. So I actually find that a lot of these things that I've been talking about, and I do actually say these things to my clients, that it resonates really well with them, and they can take it and use it as part of their sales tool to their market, to tell their story about how they're thinking differently about the world. And we have definitely had success with that. This links intimately with the notion of wellness, which is really, one of the main buzzwords of the day in architecture. And really wellness starts, I would say, with these tenets of the idea of natural, organic, local, and handmade. Of course, it also has to do with walkability and food production and nutrition and all the things. But architecturally, I think that this is the component of wellness. And most any developer worth their salt today is speaking the language of wellness to their clientele.
Is there any recently erected building out there that expresses what you imagine architecture would look like in the future? Or is it just some sort of a variant of traditional, or perhaps is this a classical reawakening inspired by the past, whose success or failure would depend on how it's framed and promoted in the modern world?
Yeah, so I've tried hard not to use historic examples and there are things that all of us can imagine in Art Nouveau or definitely the arts and crafts, and even ancient Greek classicism is natural, local, organic, and handmade. And so those are definitely all precedents. I've also tried not to prescribe a particular style or outcome myself. I do, like I said, sort of move in this direction in my own work, and I can see changes, in my work and in the clients' thinking. As far as precedent out there, there are very few and far between things that I would feel comfortable sort of saying are doing this. There is, it's somewhat obscure, but a firm from Belgium, which is a modernist firm, designed a library in a town in Africa. And it was built by the community. And it is, if you look at the plan, it would look like a plan from the Acropolis. It looks like a classical plan. It's very rational. It's very organized. And then in three dimensions, it also has the basics of columns, entablatures, tribuated sort of forms. And it's just very interesting to me. I can share it and we can post that if there's a place to do that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you posted, one of the images you posted was of Ike Kligerman Barclay's shingle style house, because I think that they are an example, one of the few that are really trying to understand and drill down on culture and history and reinterpret it in modern archetype, a modern version. And to me, if there was more exploration like that, which is what can be modern and still connect to humanity, I think that's where the solution is, and that's the unknown forest.
Yeah, they're doing a terrific job, and I always enjoy seeing one of their projects pop up on my Instagram feed. And they're applying a lot of this logic, trying to sort of build on history without copying history, and also not taking it too far so that it's sort of odd and out of place. It still has a sort of comfortable level to it. And so, yes, I think that's a great example.
Just a follow-up question on that. Would you say that bringing back kind of traditional architecture courses in university is a big step toward having this reawakening? I would think so, that it makes sense to be trained on kind of these beautiful buildings and classical architecture, the language, in order to have students then reinterpret it, you know, into this modern day, you know.
Yeah, I think that the challenge is, you know, especially in the schools that have adopted a classical curriculum, and they're very limited, and they have varying degrees of that. You know, that the curriculum would not skew entirely towards precedent and dogma and rules and patterns and things, and sort of learning the rote aspects of classicism, sort of learn and understand that, but that there would also be offered sort of other avenues of thought that would sort of introduce some of these ideas of nature and natural materials and organic forms. I think that would be healthy. I also think that that's an important thing. I mean, I went to school, and I'm not sure when David went to architecture school, but architecture changed in about a year and a half. It went from being pretty straight modern to postmodernism during the course of time that I was in college. It changed in school. The professors were sort of, you know, the sort of thinking within the school changed, and then that got out into the profession. And I think that really the schools are the hotbed of where things like this have to happen and start the change. It's not going to happen necessarily in the big established architectural practices. It's you know, it's someplace where people can safely take risks, can think new things, say crazy things, and get heard.
Yeah, I graduated in '85, exactly at that time, more or less exactly the time you're describing. And it was the learning from Las Vegas. It was the reemergence of classical architecture through what was pastiche postmodernism, but it really is what brought a lot of us together to start down this traditional path of starting from that moment that there's something important there, and actually drilling down and realize, well, there's actually a lot more important there than even what was being done in the mid '80s.
Right.
The next question was, would it be beneficial to change the way we build would it be beneficial to change the way we build to incorporate more natural materials? Who could inform such practices?
So if I interpret that question, I don't know if that's referring to like the building codes or
I think it's your point about how do we get people reset, reoriented back to local labor, local materials? Like, who's going to do that? And I think that, yeah, so that's the question.
Yeah, we have to be advocates for local materials, local craftspeople, people that I call the maintenance class, which, by the way, back to your question about siding, wood siding and the regular painting of wood siding is an economy that supports a certain segment of the maintenance class. And those are people with legitimate careers that are maintaining our houses, painters, roofers, plumbers, all those people are, you know, often with clients we constantly hear, you know, they want something maintenance free. But I think nothing comes free without a cost. And also when you do that, you are forsaking a certain segment of the working population that is finds its livelihood in the maintenance of architecture. And I think that they're an important class that needs to be recognized. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in terms of advocacy, I've actually been thinking that there ought to be a site, a website, someone should do it, maybe we can all get together, which is sort of like an Etsy for building materials that would be focused on, the small, obscure producers that have difficulty being found, even by architects who might want to find them. To find somebody who's in the mountains of Idaho making tile that might be perfect for your project is very hard to find right now. And it's a lot like Etsy, where you can get, handmade things out of Montana that you would never have otherwise found. So I think there's an opportunity there. I don't think it's a lead type thing because they're not focused on these same criteria. They're focused on materials that they rate, for their technological reasons. So I think that there's an opportunity there to advocate, again, using technology to support the natural and organic.
Yeah, lead is always disturbing to me. It's a bean counter solution, commercially based, and it should be just a natural process of a designer architect's job and not necessarily what it is. But
yeah,
I think it's interesting, going back to what Kathleen brought up earlier and connecting to your point of educating people. How do you educate is one of the things that the emerging group is the next project they're thinking about doing. Is that how do you educate people on the importance of traditional classical architecture in developments? And is it, and the talk on their part is that, can we get a panel together perhaps, probably from New York, because there is a lot of really good traditional work going on in New York, and actually try and convince developers that there is actually a return on investment for doing it right. Because clearly, Ramsey wouldn't be building one traditional tower after another if there wasn't a return on investment.
Right. I would advocate that the ICAA build a bridge to ULI, Urban Land Institute, which hosts a conference, actually several conferences, but the big one each year, I think, is in the fall when it's not COVID time. And that is again, a place where developers go to share success stories, to learn what other people are doing. I think if we have an advocacy for a certain approach and we think that we can tell a story about how developers can build value, that would be the place to do it. If we could have a panel that would be accepted on their seminar program for their conference, it would begin bit by bit to make some traction. The other place is Congress for the New Urbanism, which is a little bit more of a comfortable bedfellow for ICAA, would be to do a similar thing at the annual Congress, for the ICAA to host panels that would advocate for these types of things.
We are actually, one of the projects that we are supporting, our chapter, along with, it's in very early stages, is called Architectural Delight. And you can find architecturaldelight.org and architecture.delight on IG. It's just starting. It hasn't really actually started yet. But that is our goal. Our goal is to figure out how possibly we can build a quorum and maybe get together as a group and look at architecture differently, which is basically, which is a sort of a way that it's very similar, analogous to yours, but different. The way we've broken it down was cultural sustainability and contextual sustainability together is a Vitruvian principle. And if you just take those two elements, it's not talking about style. If it's connecting to people, culture, and history, then therefore it can be as modern as you want. And that's sort of our thinking. Yeah. But our goal would be, is that to get people from all over the country together for 2 or 3 days and talk about this. So we'll see how that ends up developing over the next year or so. Go ahead, Kathleen. Yeah. I'm sorry.
And just to underscore, we've talked about that I've sort of avoided setting precedent for it. And I also am very careful not to use the word style about whole architecture. I don't think it's style. It's a way of thinking. If you think like that, you could build something that, ostensibly is a modern shape, simply formed, but if you make it natural, organic, local, handmade, and just, then it would inherently have a traditional sort of feel. I always think about the sort of tavern, the Greek taverna on the beach, you know, that's made of just logs. It's a classical building. So I think if you just start to think this way, you don't need to dictate style.
The word modern was basically stolen from us stolen from everybody instead of international style. So modernism is referred to as international style. In reality, if you do a search on Google right now for the top modern architects of the 19th century, Edwin Lutyens is going to come up. And that may sound ludicrous to you, but when you've had the opportunity to actually walk into an Edwin Lutyens building and you look at the details, he was so brilliant and so modern and pushing the envelope at the minute level to a point where it really makes your head spin how sophisticated he was in reinterpreting the canons of architecture. So we need to get that back on track.
Yes. Yeah.
Here's a question. What do you think are the biggest obstacles to building with traditional techniques and natural materials? Lack of knowledge, lack of skilled artisans, or more expensive materials?
It's the cost or the perceived cost. I had a project where we wanted to do load-bearing stone columns on a portico to the building, and everybody told us it was too expensive. The structural engineer said he couldn't figure it out. Somehow the wisdom of the ages had left him. But you know, we were told it needed to be steel with veneer stone wrapping the column. And again, it was a long process, but gradually working, you know, finding some local stone that wasn't that expensive, convincing the structural engineer, convincing the contractor, getting the owner was always interested, never put their foot down to stop it, but it needed to be proved to them that it was a reasonable thing to do. And I think, yeah, so I think cost is generally the question with wood siding, with any of these things. What's the cost benefit of doing it this way? And it's not always as straight to the bottom line, you know, first cost sort of savings that modern architecture might have.
Do you think that people perceive the costs initially as more than they really are? I think that is like a common, maybe it's a myth, that the cost of building traditionally is just too much, but we don't really know how much. Yeah, right. So do people perceive it as more?
Yeah, I mean, people still say widely that you can't build it like that anymore, which I think most of us on this call know that you can build it like that if you want to, and it's really more a matter of making the decision and moving forward with it.
I think we should go over this when we do the panel, kind of convincing developers about this and really go over the costs. I would love to see that. Just, you know.
Yeah, I could go into more.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd really just like
get more tangible examples.
The cost question and you know, really address it.
Well, see, it's easy to throw cost in our face when in reality, if you look at the San Francisco Federal Building by Morphosis, that was over budget, and they had to eliminate air conditioning so that they could put the screen up on the outside. But you ignore the fact that, again, it goes back to resilience. What is it worth if a building is going to be adored for 100 to 150 years, as many classical or traditional buildings are, with traditional and natural materials, and you compare that to a building that's going to have a life cycle of 40 to 50 years, like it totally changes your perspective on the cost. And that's where I think the brainwashing is a bad word, but the education needs to begin.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much for this provocative presentation. Retired after many years from teaching design at an art school in California. The curriculum began to address some of these issues over a decade ago, but they seem to diminish the importance of art history, not just Western art history, in preference for contemporary directions in film, television, and game design industries. How can faculty reinforce the natural laws that you describe when corporate trends have so much influence? You have 2 days to answer that question. That's a great one.
Yeah, I think we need to continue to advocate for architectural history to, you know, maintain architectural history programs in all the architecture schools, to advocate for it to be part of the curriculum, part of the requirement. I had to take architectural history. I ended up marrying an architectural historian. New people, young people that we hire in our office, I often, you know, mention historic precedent to them, like Lutyens. I'll mention, and I'll get a blank stare, which kind of blows me away. But you know, so I send them off and tell them, you know, go learn about Lutyens and look at this detail or that detail. I think that all architects, even if you want to be a strictly modern architect, all architects need to have a basic understanding of the sort of sweep of architectural history.
Yeah, I've only been to one project at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., and walking through it, it reminded me of a quote from Eric Clapton when he saw Jimi Hendrix the very first time, and he said, "I wanted to sell my guitar." And that's what I was seeing. I was seeing architectural detailing played out at a level, walking around with other architects,
Right.
basically looking at details, saying, "I wouldn't let that off my drafting board. It looks so wrong," and it was so perfect.
Right.
It's,
Right.
Should we, I know
go ahead.
we're kind of running short on time, or we're out of time, but I would love to ask this question for any students or young professionals watching. What advice do you have, say, for a student in architecture who's interested in classical architecture, or a young professional working at a firm that maybe doesn't follow any of this? What advice do you have for the young ones?
I think, you know, on the grand scale, basically what I've been saying is don't be sort of hoodwinked that the future is going to be futuristic, that iPhones have anything to do with the future of architecture. The iPhones are going to be replaced with something else later. But architecture is going to persist, and it doesn't have to be new and fancy. And you can just think that globally. I think on the sort of small scale level, it's always fun to try to be subversive and change things from within at your level, where you are, whatever you're doing or being given to do, you know, consider your choices and propose other things, even to your seniors. You know, work to change the system from within. It seems like a very sort of hippie sort of approach to things. But I think that everyone at any level of their career development has their own sphere of decision making and communication ability, where they can gently push and prod for what they think is right.
Lovely, thank you. Do we have time to ask any more questions, or what do you think, David?
How are you doing, David? Do you have a couple more minutes?
I'm good. Yes. Yeah.
So just a comment, I think Louis Sullivan was in tune with these issues well before they became critical. I hope his oeuvre can enter into the mix as well as the conversation as it goes forward. I would recommend every single person, I watch, if you do a search on YouTube, there's a movie on Louis Sullivan. It's about an hour and 40 minutes long documentary. I watch it once a year. It's the saddest, most tragic, most wonderful thing you'll ever watch. And it's important enough that I rewatch it every year, about how he was a truly modern, wonderful architect that basically, it's a tragic, wonderful story.
Yeah, there are these bellwethers that like Sullivan, and also Victor Horta comes to mind in Belgium, who were able to sort of see the world and then think differently and create something new and unique that still felt grounded in the natural world. And I've hesitated sort of making too much of that, because I don't want to be perceived as a advocate for a revival of Art Nouveau, which I think this whole thing could go down that path or be pegged that. I mean, obviously those kinds of ideas would fit within whole architecture, but whole architecture to me is not an advocacy for a return, you know, a revival of another previous style. So it's more, you know, how do we get in their heads, learn about them, what they were thinking, so that we can use those tools and design something for the here and now.
A new modernism. Have you worked with or considered rammed earth structure? That was a question. How does that fit in?
I personally have not. I've been involved in a project where some rammed earth buildings had been done previously, and yeah, I'm a big fan. I think it's amazing. I was shocked at how wonderful it looked and felt, and also how well it was lasting on this particular building I saw, which was in Tucson, Arizona.
Excellent. Can you please speak to the perspective of architecture reflecting the value of times?
Yeah, so I think that hopefully from my talk you gathered that I sort of think time is immaterial, that time is not necessarily linear, that there's a T.S. Eliot quote that history is now in England, basically that time, the present is always, tomorrow will be the present, the past was the present, and that we should focus on where we are right now and do what we think is right for what we are. I think that, you know, sometimes I think what modern architects, when they say a building should be of its time, is that they're trying to anticipate the future. You know, they're trying to use that as a way to leapfrog and make things ever more shockingly different and new, versus making it really of our time right now, which incorporates the past, the present, and the future all in once. It's kind of a metaphysical or transcendental, I guess I should say, approach to time.
Well, this has been wonderful, and I want to thank you, David, but I also want to thank Kathleen, because as I mentioned before, the solution is in the youth. And our emerging professionals group, built by Kathleen, again, she's a board member, she came to our board as a non-architect. She's in real estate and she was a graduate student in Boston, and cared enough about our urban fabric, our architectural fabric, and to join our ICAA board. And we're the old dinosaurs. The future is in Kathleen and these emerging professionals. So Kathleen, thank you very much. And David, you were awesome.
Yeah, and thank you, Kathleen. I was honored to be able to speak to your group. This is exactly where I think the message needs to get out and be heard. And whether it's this particular direction or if it just changes people's, you know, thinking and gets them sort of evaluating what they're doing and making different choices, then we'll keep moving the needle.
Well, thank you so
That's
much.
awesome.
I loved it just as much as I loved the presentation a few years back. But we hope to, I hope we got some new emerging professionals to kind of join our group so we can continue events moving forward and just continue the conversation. So I hope this is just the start of more conversations. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
for
everybody.
coming. Thank you.
Bye-bye.